This is part 2 of my interview with recording engineer producer Elliot Scheiner. Elliot has 25 Grammy nominations and 8 Grammy wins. He's worked on such classic records as Van Morrison's Moondance and Steely Dan's Asia. His discography reads like a who's who of the record business. Beyonce, Foo Fighters, Sting, Clapton, Steely Dan, and the Eagles, just to name a few. I first met Elliot when I started working at A&R Recording. He had just won his first Grammy for Steely Dan's Asia. We were both trained by Phil Ramone, so we've got a few Phil stories in here. This episode will talk about Elliot's work with Steely Dan, the Eagles, Foo Fighters, Beck, and a few others. I'll put some links down below to a Spotify playlist that covers some of the songs we're talking about and his Toontrack's drum library. Elliot, thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it. I'm having a lot of fun going through your discography. There's just so much great stuff. And I will film an opening before this where I talk about your Grammy nominations and all that stuff. But there's a million rabbit holes I could go down. And I think some of them are just fun. You know, and today I also want to discuss some of your later work too, which I didn't as much in the last video.
Okay.
But a great example is Enoch Light's 21 Trombones. Dig this. A few things I just stumbled upon with just 21 trombones.
Right.
All right. So your uncle Chauncey, it was Chauncey, right? Chauncey Welsh played on that, right?
Yeah.
Who got you the job at A&R. That's very cool.
Yeah.
But Cate Blanchett's most recent movie, Tar, re-recorded That Rainy Day from 21 Trombones, meaning the same, I guess they couldn't get the rights, but a movie she did like a year ago, that's in it.
Really?
And they recreated the entire recording. I guess they could, and it's beautiful. It's just fantastic. And it's on the soundtrack. So there's one interesting thing. It was chosen in a contemporary movie about a music conductor. The second thing I thought of too was when I was working with Phil, we used to mic trumpets with a single U87 in a circle. And I was wondering if any of that came out of 21 Trombones, where you had 21 brass players and you didn't have that many. Even when we had inputs, we would put trumpets in a circle around a U87 in Omni. And I'm just curious if it came out of that session.
No, because he wanted individual control of every bone. So they all had their own mics.
I found an interview with Donald where he said his early hi-fi experiences was listening to Enoch Light recordings.
I could understand that. You know, that guy, as much as I didn't really care too much about what he did, he was really bent on if there was high resolution. You know,
Next interesting thing about 21 Trombones is that was recorded to Mag. Now, I remember Phil telling me that he had done some recordings to Mag. I had thought he had said the band, but I couldn't find any record of Phil working with the band. But it says on the album jacket, it was a label that released recordings that were done on 35 millimeter Mag. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, Mag is a film stock that has magnetic recording coating on it, and it's thicker and deeper like a modern half-inch 2-track would be, so you could pound it with a lot more level. But it says that right on the cover, recorded to 35 millimeter Mag film. Do you remember that?
No, I do remember it was 8-track. Yeah, it was an 8-track recording. And he might have eventually, because the Mag that we had in the film room was only 3 tracks.
Right.
So he must have transferred a mix to Mag.
Right. But it was fascinating. I never knew there was a label that would boast that. You know, it's on the cover of the album.
You know, do you remember there was a studio in New York called Bob Fine?
Oh, sure.
That was his label.
Oh, that was his, because the thing is, what it reminded me of was one of the major headaches of my life was Paul Simon's One Trick Pony. Phil had mixed to stereo by the time I got involved in it. But he insisted that we mix that to Mag. So at the Hit Factor, we got mag machines from Bob Fine, and we put them in the vocal booth, and we reprinted all the mixes directly to mag for the film.
Yeah.
Which was a you remember Mag. That was a monstrous headache. No erase head, no rewind, no nothing. Yeah, and I also want to ask you about Brooks Arthur, because you guys sort of crossed over a lot. I noticed there were credits that the artists seemed to go back and forth between the two of you.
I only worked with Brooks once, where I was a second, and it's a classic moment. He's working with Jeff Barry. They're doing a song, and Jeff is listening to it. Everything is... It was a stereo date. It wasn't even 4-track. Everything was live to stereo. And Jeff is listening. He looks up at Brooks and he said, "I think we need more bass." And Brooks looked at him and he nods and said, "Okay." In Studio A at 112, there were 2 rotary faders about 6 foot high above the 670. There were nothing. You could use it. You could actually use the fader, but you had to patch it in. And he said, "Okay, let me know when it's enough." And he reached up with his fader and grabbed it and started to turn it. And Jeff would go, "Yeah, that's good."
Yeah, I have one of those. I'll tell you offline sometime.
Okay.
where you turn the knob that's not doing anything.
Oh yeah, that's it.
I mean, I can always edit it out. But what it was is I was setting up a recording in Aaron Barron and Larry Dahlstrom's truck at the Smithsonian for Boyer, and so Jim's schedule was tight. I was getting everything levels. Jim was going to come down and record it, at the 8:00 show. So the mics weren't going anywhere. Comes in the truck and goes, "Okay, yeah, that's much better."
Yeah, there are a lot of those, man.
My next question was, how does your relationship with Steely Dan come about? But you just started on that with Jay and the Americans, I guess.
Gary Katz knew all about these guys, and he knew that they were good writers. And Gary moved out to L.A., and took a job at ABC Dunhill. And he brought Donald and Walter out to write for ABC Dunhill. And at some point when they were doing this, they were writing stuff that they would write. And all of it seemed weird to record guys. So they formed a band, and Gary had ABC sign the band. They had done, I'm pretty sure, 4 records, 3 or 4 records. And I knew Gary also from Jay and the Americans. I did a record. Do you remember Felix Cavalier?
Cavalier, yeah, sure.
Okay. I did a solo record with Felix. And it wasn't a big record, it was Felix singing and playing organ, and, it was Felix. But they had heard it. They heard the way it sounded, and I get a call from Gary to record Royal Scam. And by that time, they were already big. They had a bunch of hits. They had just finished Katie Lied with Roger, and Roger was trying to use noise reduction for tape, and he used the DBX noise reduction. All the time they were working at ABC, it was fine. But when they left to go somewhere else, came back, somebody else was using it, and it got all turned around, and they couldn't get anything to play back correctly. So they went up to DBX, Massachusetts, and the story was, "This doesn't sound like anything we recorded." And the tech there said, "Okay, I'm going to tighten this up. Let me know when it sounds good." And that was it. Let me know.
Yeah. Well, that's going to get to our 3M story in a little bit, but yeah.
So, they were just hated the whole happening of Katie lied and what it sounded like at the time. So when they started to do Royal Scam, Gary called me and said, they want you to record the tracks on this new album. I said, yeah, great. We'll pay you X amount of bucks. The whole project will take about 2 months. But before we do that, we want to work at an A&R. We've never done that. We love the Felix record. We want to use that room. So we got a bunch of rhythm guys from New York, and we recorded there. We did like a lot of the, what was that one song? Is there gas in the car?
Is there gas in the car? Oh, God, I love that line. Kid Charlemagne.
Yeah, we recorded a lot of the Royal Scam in New York.
Was that at A&R?
Yeah.
A1?
Yeah.
Do you remember what mics you used on drums and piano on Royal Scam?
The actual parts we recorded at A&R, well, it was always a 57 on snare. Right. And it was only upper only. The toms were 421s. The hat was an RE15. The kick mic was an RE20. The overheads were 414s.
Did you use any roll-off on those?
No.
Yeah, see, that's one thing that I wish I knew was when I started engineering, guys were using the overheads kind of as cymbal mics. Not as drum mics, full kit. And it wasn't until much later that I learned that all the body of the toms was in those overheads.
Yeah. It's funny that I did date a class with Chuck Linley. We each had our own mic set of the drums, so you could see the difference. And he was using DPA?
Yeah, B&K, yeah.
And I was using 67s. When I did with Chuck, Chuck is an amazing engineer, and he does shit. He actually, when you listen to the way Chuck does a date, it's like he just mixed it. Just really great sounding. And when he opened my mics, he said, well, man, you got a lot of the kit in here. Oh, well, yeah, that's the point.
Yeah. Yeah, but in the 80s, it was that whole gated toms and, close miking and all that stuff. And so it wasn't until later in my career that I'm like, oh, shit, you leave the overheads all the way open, and that's the whole body of the drums.
Yeah. We recorded a lot of the Royal Scam in New York, and we did about 4 or 5 things there. And then they said, we want to go to L.A., and record the rest of the tracks there because we want to use L.A. players. They got me a ticket to go to L.A., first-class ticket. Going, wow. I get to the airport. They had a guy bring up a Mercedes 450 convertible.
Those were the days, weren't they?
And I'm staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel. I'm going, wow. This is like incredible. I don't know a single person in LA, not one person. So we go in the studio the first 2 days. It was Jim Gordon, Jamie Jamerson, Larry Carlton, and Al. Walter brought in magneplaners. I had never used them before and never wanted to use them again. They had 604s in there, and I said, gee, I'd really like to work on the 604. No, we want these speakers. Okay. So we did 2 nights there. And on the 3rd day of me being there, I get a call from Gary. We're not going to work tonight. We're going to take off. And then it happened, it was actually the next 3 nights we were not going to work. So now I worked for 2 days, and the next 5 days I was in my hotel with not much to do and really bored. And I never got a track with him out there. And it was now almost 2 months. And one day, they called me to cancel the session again, and I didn't say anything. And I had the ticket back home, and I just left. I didn't tell Donald, Walter, or Gary, I'm gone. I just went. And I never heard from them either. I get back home, never hear from them. The scam comes out, my name's misspelled, and I thought that was intentional. And I never hear from him. But then I get a call from Gary again, and this is after a year or more. And he said, we've got this album, and we want you to mix it. And I had never mixed anything for him. And they came back to A&R, brought tapes. It was Asia. We mixed the whole thing there. We had a few weird things happen, but it all got done. But when they came in the studio for the first day, we hadn't talked in years, except my conversation with Gary. Me and Donald are the only ones in there. And he says, so why'd you do it? And I didn't think anything. And must be somebody else in the room. And then I hear it again. So why'd you do it? And I look over here and I said, are you talking to me? And he said, yeah. Why did you leave? And I went through the story of the cancellations, and I was being paid for 2 months. And those 2 months were up, so I didn't think we were going to do much more. And I was bored to death staying out in the hotel. So, but we became huge friends after that.
Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, in the reissue of The Royal Scam, said, quote, they referred to the EMT plates at $7.99 as the grandest in the land. What do you remember about those plates and how they were set up?
Okay, well, you could never determine how it was set up because Phil wouldn't allow anybody in the chamber room when he was lining the chambers.
One thing I remember from A&R, and maybe this is incorrect, but I thought most studios had remotes on the EMT chambers where you could change it. A&R didn't. And no. I recall you weren't allowed to go down there and change the decay times.
That's correct.
It's amazing. And the other thing was, I remember Phil in R2, I think one thing that really adds magic to some of those records that he did was he had a match pair of plates. So everybody in the world was using a stereo EMT where mono input and a faux stereo output. And we used one side of each plate, and you could pan true stereo to 2 plates.
Correct.
And it was great. I mean, the reverb on those records is just baffling.
Phil, who knows what he did? Nobody had any idea. It wasn't only Steely, it was everybody was amazed with the way the chamber sounded. And I remember Phil getting a call from Larry Levine at A&M.
Yeah.
And he asked Phil if he would come out and tune their chambers. And, he thought, well, I'm going to fly out first class and stay at a great hotel. I'm going. And he went out there for a week to enjoy himself.
That's great. Yeah, and what I recall, especially in the 80s, something that drove me nuts was you went to every other studio, and for some reason, they thought you had to crank the tension up on the plates. They would double the springs and make them really tight. And they weren't lush. Most other studios I would just go into and just go, oh, geez, this sounds like a tin can. I started at A&R right after you won the Grammy for Asia. So the 8068 Neve had just been put in. in A1. So before that, was that the ADM console? Was that what you did Asia on?
Yeah. Yeah, I mixed Asia on that and recorded Peg on that console.
And that's all manual, too.
Yes.
Back in that day, that was, you get 3 people at the console and a lot of grease pencil marks, and it's fun.
Well, that's what they wanted to do. They were accustomed to doing that. And I said to them after about 2 passes where Gary was writing the guitar and Donald was writing the vocal and Walter was writing some other stuff, and they'd always get it wrong. I said, here's where we have to go. And finally, by the 3rd pass, I said, okay, we can't do it this way. I can't be here and have to do what I'm doing, and you guys make mistakes, and I have to do it again because of you.
Yeah.
So then they stopped, and they didn't touch anything anymore. Okay, on Asia, the multi-track was 24, but everything was all over the place. Like, you might have had a guitar solo on with percussion.
Right, on the same track.
Right. Drums, bass, all that was pretty honest. But you couldn't do a full mix on the song without stopping. So, according to the way it was, you had to do the intro separately, and then you had to do a verse separately. And we were editing that as we went on 2-track. So never hearing the full piece as it was. And I remembered having to, during the Wayne Shorter and Gadd solo sections, I had to mute the bass. And somewhere after that, there was enough leakage on the drum mics from the bass, and it was an electric bass, and enough so you could put the drums up and go, oh yeah, there's the bass, but it wasn't there. So I had to mute it in the solo section and mute it at the end, and I get a call from Gary Katz a few weeks later. He says, I don't think there's any bass in the last section. And I said, no, that's not possible, And he says, well, it sounds like we want to come back to New York and redo Asia. And, I realized there are no notes. There was no notes, Everything was handheld, and whatever you put on in terms of EQ, it was there. I wrote down certain things, like the EQ on tracks that had like electric guitar and maybe had something else on it, and I had to change from verse to chorus. I would notate what that was, so I could change it as we went along. But I didn't have to do anything with bass EQ, drum EQ, piano EQ, So I had everything else done. They decided to come back. I still had the Asia Masters at A&R. I put it up that morning. Rack was my assistant. I knew the sections that didn't have bass. I tried to match the EQ from the original mix so that I could cut in. Oh,
yeah. Oh, no, so you don't have to redo the whole thing, right?
Right. So they come walking in, Walter, Donald, and Gary, and I said, you guys are wrong. There is a ton of bass on this record. And they said, no, it's not possible. Play it back. And I played it back with the edit that I cut in, and they're like looking at each other. That's impossible. I made it a little louder so they could really hear the bass. And And then I fessed up. I said, well, I cut the piece in. Oh, okay, well, let's start over.
Oh, no.
And we spent the next period of time doing it all over.
Oh gosh, it's funny. I've mixed a few records in Atmos that were old classic recordings, and I find all these oopses, and I'm hearing it in my mix, and then I go back and listen to the original record, and I go, no, that's in the original record. There's one where, like, Billy sings a word and then says it cues the band with intro, and like you couldn't manually get the fader down fast enough, so if you listen to the record, it's like in. But in digital, of course, you could remove it. But,
Right.
There's a lot of stuff like that in the records.
Did you do that?
What?
Did you remove it?
It's one of the few cases where I did. In general, I'd left stuff as it was.
That should be the point. I did Ocean Boulevard for
Right, 461 Ocean Boulevard.
Right. The organ player, piano player, knew that I was redoing it, and at the very end, you could hear it on the stereo, he holds like an eighth note longer than everybody else. And he called me up and said, could I end with everybody? And I said, it's like that on the stereo.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to be accused of corrupting what was done.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think you leave all that stuff in because those original mixes and productions are imprinted in your brain. There's stuff that I love, and do not mess with it. Even some stuff that's stereo remastered. It's like, you didn't have to touch this. I don't care why you thought this was better. I didn't need it brighter. I was in love with it as it was, Is it true Haitian Divorce is about you?
Yeah. Yeah, when we were making Haitian Divorce, well, we hadn't yet. We were doing Royal Scam in that first week, and my accountant calls up and said I just was about to get a divorce. And he said, you need to do it before the year ends. So I just told her, can we take off a couple of days next week? I have to go down to Haiti. And he said, what for? And I said, I'm getting divorced. And he looked at me like, you're going to Haiti to get divorced? I said, yeah, the lawyer said that's the place to do it now. So I went down and I got divorced. And when I came back, it was like, Don and Walter, all they wanted to know about, what's the country like? What was it like? What was the divorce like? What were the people like? How did you get there? Were there more people? And I explained the whole situation to him. And it really wasn't about me. The title was about me.
Yeah, it triggered the thought. It triggered the idea.
Yeah.
So you mixed Asia, just obviously phenomenal sounding record.
Thank you.
On the ADM desk. Was it 604s? Or were you at Visonic Davids by then?
No, they weren't Visonics. They were KLH. They were small.
Oh, I remember those. All the rooms at A&R had them, those.
Right, those.
Speakers to me are like girlfriends. I love them at first, and then like a year and a half later, it's like I can't stand them. So,
yeah, I went through that period of the Visonic period. Nobody wanted to work on those except Steely. I mean, I used it for tracking and was okay with it. I fell out of love with them too. My son Matt, he opened a box in the basement, and they were the Visonics in this case. And he said, well, when did you use this? I said, I used it to do Nightfly. And
I think you used them on Gaucho too. Because I wasn't really...
Yeah,
you did a lot of Gaucho, a lot of Nightfly at Automated, and I saw them at A&R.
Yeah, I used them there too.
At that point, I wasn't disciplined enough to use David's because they just sounded too pretty to me, and I would have destroyed myself.
They were. Finally, I'm at a point in my life where I have a pretty pair of speakers. I'm using the ATCs for stereo, only stereo. And, they're a little too good, but I've sort of got the feel for them now.
I have two memories of you. Well, I have three memories of you working on Gaucho.
Are they bad?
No. Well, no, one of them's funny. So the first memory I have of you working on Gaucho was me walking in the control room and studying the console carefully after you had finished tracking and seeing nothing. Like, you just knew what to do and where to do it. It wasn't like you were pulling all kinds of tricks and there's tons of EQ, and it was just doing the right thing for the right instrument. And I was like, I wanted to see something that would like jump out at me like I can copy from Elliot. But, it was, I guess it's just having your taste.
Well, it was Phil's taste, in a sense. He said, you don't like it? Do something with the mic. Change the mic.
Yeah.
Adjust it.
Yeah.
And it was about that. Because he was so used to, there were no EQs or compression or anything, you had to deal with the mic and the player.
Yeah, here's a question that I don't think I expect you to really have an answer to, but it's just me voicing my opinion when you saying that that's Phil's taste. I kind of have this feeling that like East Coast recordings were sort of raw and in your face and lively, but the recordings I envied was what I think of as the West Coast sound.
I agree.
When I listen to like America, Horse with No Name, or even, I know it's not West Coast, but like Elton John, Tumbleweed Connection. How did you, and also Phil's sound can be a little knuckly too sometimes, but it's like, so how did you made that transition? Because in my mind, you've got that West Coast sound.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't think I was as good. Those West Coast guys, where you'd hear like Russ Kunkel or the bass playing drummer that played on all those hit records.
That's Leland Sklar.
But I thought, it was the bass player would always use a pick,
right,
for bass. You go, wow, what is that? I've never heard that. And listening to Elton John, his first record, I remember all the engineers at A&R came into A1 and we played that record in the 604s and went, holy shit, what is that?
Yeah. And it doesn't, to me, that doesn't happen. That, of course, I remember as a kid, Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. And then if you go to the 80s, I heard like Supertramp, Breakfast in America, or Yes, Roundabout. You just heard these records that were like, holy shit, this. And I got to say, I got that feeling first time I heard Hell Freezes Over.
Really?
Like, oh yeah. That version of Hotel California, I don't know what the low end is on that. I don't know if it's a cajon or whatever, but it's just phenomenal.
Scotty played drums on that, or he played bongos and timbales, and he had an electronic bass drum, and he was hitting that, and it just didn't. I felt it wasn't strong enough. So we had, I'm trying to remember, an LA percussionist, I can't remember his name now, and he brought, not a cajon, name another percussion instrument. You would mic it at the top and underneath. It was a big drum.
Right.
And so I mic'd it in both places. And he tried to do it with the bass drum. I only wanted him to play it with the bass drum, and I ended up flying in everything with the bass drum. We had transferred the analog tapes to a Sony 3348, and I flew in the bass drum there to match his bass drum.
Yeah, it sounds great. Is that all really live? Because the acoustic guitar sounds are surprisingly good for directs.
They were they directs?
I mean, maybe you put a mic in the guitar that I couldn't see, but they don't sound that directy to me. Maybe you had a mic inside.
But I remember, the TV show. That's what it was.
Yeah, so it was live, whatever it was. I was surprised.
It was. They were directs in those. What was that guitar? Japanese guitar manufacturer.
Takamine.
It was that, and they designed a guitar for him
because it sounds really nice, and I was surprised. Now, continuing on working with the Eagles, you worked on the reissue stuff. Now, earlier we talked about the fact that we both love the LA sound of engineers. One of my heroes is Bill Szymczyk.
Yeah.
Did you learn anything working with Bill Szymczyk? What was he like to be with?
Well, my only thing is when I mixed Hotel California, the original album, Bill came in for that. He wanted to be a part of it, and he wanted to learn what surround was. And he was so cool. I mean, he was everything you'd want him to be. He was just, you loved being there with him. He was just the most gentle person. And he was telling me about every detail when they recorded it. Bill also did all the Joe Walsh LPs, which were
and oh god, what is that? Funk 49? My god, that sounds so good. Oh, that sounds so good.
Yeah.
Did you ever cross paths with Joe Walsh? Any crazy Joe Walsh stories?
Not crazy. Joe Walsh was one of the nicest guys ever. Really a guy you wanted to be around. You wanted to be with and talk. And he had the coolest things to say. He was great.
Yeah, no, he seems like he would be a lot of fun under any circumstances.
Great jokes.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
But anything on the engineering or producing front as far as an approach or a style or...
Phil, he'd call me when he did something, and he'd say, "What's wrong with this?" And I'd look at his EQ, and instead of... he very seldom attenuated anything. It was always, I'll boost it 1K. And not a little bit, a lot. He never took anything out that might be wrong with recording. It wasn't because he did or anything. It was just the sound of the instrument or, it wasn't good. And, I learned more and more on my own about what frequencies were detrimental to certain instruments, to guitars and to drums. And, but as far as, he told me, try and record with almost nothing in line. It's about you and the mic and player. And that was big with Phil. And it was big with his partner, Don Fry, too.
You kind of hit on 2 points as far as the equalization. It's like two different... For one thing, we had earlier in the conversation, I had mentioned that I thought you got the LA sound, like you got the West Coast sound, like the Szymczyk sound and stuff like that. And I think possibly the point that you just made about using more cut EQ could be part of that. And there was urban myth going around that Elliot Scheiner, what I heard was, and I've used it, by the way, whether or not it's true, Elliot Scheiner, likes to cut 250. And the funny thing about that was to cut, like pull the mud out, cut around, suck out around 250. And Marty Robertson said that really pissed you off because it was 350.
That's right.
Is any truth to that?
Yeah, true. It was 350.
Yeah, well, the reason I thought I would believe Marty on the 350 is there's no 250 on a Neve equalizer.
No.
I mean, there's an interesting point about your sound, which is the mid-range band. If you want to cut 350, that's in the mid-range.
Right.
So if you're cutting 350, that means you can't be boosting mid-range on a Neve, which was Phil's favorite thing to do. Like 3.2K, boom. You know? A lot of 3.2K.
Yeah, sure. If I get in trouble where I needed the mid-range for something, I go down to 300 on the lower side.
On the lower side, right, right.
R1, after they got rid of the Neumann, they put an MCI in there.
Yeah, that's when I started.
Okay, and I started fooling around with the bass drum, and I was just doing stuff, not really, but that's when I hit, it was 300, and I attenuated 300 and heard what the bass drum sounded like. When I did that, I went, oh my God. You know, it was like, to me, I found the ultimate, what needs to be attenuated on the kick drum. And all of a sudden, it had a major life to what it sounded like. And that was the most memorable thing on that MCI, which I never really liked. You know, it was...
I hated the 500.
Yeah.
I hated it.
It was just there.
Yeah, the 600 I liked, but the 500 I hated. And the thing about that, too, that I've noticed when you do that, pulling out the 350, like if you boost a little lower, like 60 or 80, it's almost like you've tuned the drum down deeper, the bass drum down deeper.
Okay, here it is. I would attenuate at 350 a good at least 4 dB, and I'd boost at 30.
Oh, maybe that's what. Oh no, you said you didn't EQ that Madeline Perot kick. No. I'm wondering if that's what I heard. Boost at 30.
Yeah.
But so my two other Gaucho memories are, and I can cut this one out. But you pulling me aside when you were in A1 and saying, "Can you make the room go down?" You had been trying to get a drum sound for like 12 hours, and you had it. You know, with the guy, you had it with Gary and Walter, and you pulled me aside. "Can you make the room go down?" I said, "Well, Elliot, the power supply." I said, "Elliot, the power supplies for the console are underneath the console, so I can't shut off the console." I said, "I can go in the rack in the back and kill the monitor amps," and you're like, "They're too smart for that." So you kept working. And the last memory I have, I remember on Gaucho, you were working in R2, and you had requested something which was insane at the time, which was 24 dB X160s. Now, this is before SSL, so this is before anybody ever saw a console with a compressor on every channel. And I was just curious if you remember that at all.
I don't remember, but I remember using DBX 160s, the old ones, during that time with them, and they loved that gear. And Donald was like, "You can't hear it. We know it's compressing, but you can't hear it." And they wanted it for a lot of things. I don't remember how many I'd asked for, but yeah, I believe that.
Cool. All right. You're one of your favorite people in the world, I know. What's the story of the Bruce Hornsby piano sound that you produced and recorded?
I went looking for a piano that sounded different. The first time you heard Elton John's piano, did you think that was, where did that come from? Yeah. You know, was his touch, was it the piano, was it the mic? What was it? So I went looking for something that could be identified with Bruce, you know? And there was this one piano in the B room at Ocean Way, which sounded different than anything I'd ever heard. You know, I said to Bruce, we should use this piano. And I explained to him why. And, you know, you should be, your piano sound should be identified, that's Bruce's piano.
Yeah.
And so I brought him over there, and he tried the piano, and he said, well, I don't really like the touch of the piano, and you can hear that it's going to go out of tune within half an hour. And that's what happened, you know. But we used it. We had a piano tuner standing by, but he really didn't like the sound. And during the whole time, we were going to other studios to hear other pianos. And I remember we went to Chick Corea's place. He had a Bosendorfer, and he played the piano, and, you know, it was an amazing sounding piano.
Yeah.
But when we brought tape with us, and, you know, we compared it to what he already played on the B piano, and he admitted it didn't sound as good. You know, it sounded great, but it didn't have whatever that B piano had, you know. So, but he kind of resented me for making him use that.
Well, he shouldn't. Do you remember what mics you used on it?
You know, I don't, because Alan, that owned Ocean Way, had so many classic mics.
Yeah.
It might have been 251s.
Yeah. And, you know, and that's a funny thing I think about engineering is a lot of times you go, oh, I'm going to go make this better, and you do something different, and you go back to listen to what you originally did, and you're just like, I don't know why it's better, but it's better. What, you know, it's funny that way.
Yeah.
Oh, do you think you compressed that piano?
No, I didn't.
Which brings up another question I've had. My memory is, I mean, back in A&R and those early, nobody was doing stereo bus compression. Do you recall it that way?
Yeah, I didn't know anybody. I mean, in those days, there was nothing in the showroom, and I don't remember anybody asking for bus compression ever.
It was a mastering thing. It would happen a little bit in mastering usually.
Right,
To
yeah.
get it to fit.
Yeah.
I mean, A1 at A&R had, you know, 4 DBX 160s, which I'd never put on a stereo bus.
No.
A couple of 1176s. It did have those Neves in the console. But, yeah, it's amazing how common that's become. And I think that's one of the, you know, I think there's a few things, the reason people like classic recordings that they don't realize. They weren't bus, there's almost no compression on them. Like you said, there's riding faders. And for those of you not familiar with riding faders, you're basically mixing to the record machine. You know, you're mixing to tape and always keeping the balances, because those consoles were all manual. You couldn't sit there and ride a mix all day long on the playback. So it was, you know, more straightforward if you did it when you were recording, you know.
Right.
So I think, you know, the sound of the rooms, the lack of compression in EQ, and the musicianship are a lot of those reasons that those classic recordings sound as good as they do.
Yeah, it was a different state of mind. You know, that's the way I was taught. Ride the fader. Always with vocals, but then it got to be, you knew what like Bernard Purdy, he would play a thing and then the whole pattern would shift to something else, or he'd go to cross stick. And you knew you had to ride there on the minute he hit that cross stick.
Yeah.
You were operating a lot of faders at once. But with Steely, nothing was ever first take most of the time. You know, so you really got the chance to operate and know what was coming up.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. The rumor I had heard was you were one of the people responsible for recording engineers becoming independent contractors, freelance, not beholden, not an employee of a studio. Is that true?
It was in New York. I don't know if it's true throughout the country, but in New York, I was the first one to go freelance because I'd been doing all these dates with Steely, and they were paying, at that point, A&R was paying me $1,000 a week, but I was bringing in, I don't know, $1 million a year or more.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't give me any kind of raise. And I went to Art. I need to do more. And, well, what do you want to do? I said, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to work with the artists I'm working. I don't want salary from you guys. I want you to give me 20% on studio time. And Art said he didn't like it, but he said okay. The first week, I went from 1,000 to over 5,000, and he freaked out. And he called me back in his office. We can't do this. I said, okay, I can't work here. And I was working with Ashford and Simpson at the time, and I called up Valerie. Can we work somewhere else? Would you guys be okay if we went to media or something? She said, fine. And they called up and canceled the next month and a half. That meant a lot to Art.
Yeah, I'll bet it did.
So Art called me back in and said, okay, we understand everything. Can we reduce the rate? So I said, to what? So they made me the offer of 15% on studio time and 10% on rentals. And it was still, knowing what I'd made that first week, yeah, that's fine. I'll do that because I'd much rather be at A&R than media. And it worked out great. I was the first guy to do that. And then as I started telling people, you guys are getting ripped off. And, everybody started to do it.
Well, I want to thank you for that because
Oh,
I certainly benefited from that. Songs in the Attic.
That was a nightmare.
That was a nightmare for more than one reason, the way I remember it.
Did you come on the road?
No, I was only at RPM. It was you and Chaz Clifton in the truck. And that brings up a very fond memory I have, which was sitting in the lounge with you and you looking at the cover of TV Guide and seeing Diana Canova, your future wife, and said, I'm going to marry this woman. And you hadn't met her yet. That is the greatest story.
Yeah, it was funny. Even Billy made fun of that.
Yeah, that's great. It's great. At RPM, we spent a lot of time at RPM. What, you were just rough mixing shows at that point, I guess?
Yeah.
And I remember, but it was like the DBX thing where I remember at 2:00 in the morning having the guy from 3M come down and tune the third harmonic distortion on the 3M till we couldn't hear distortion anymore. And we were like, what?
It was Stidge.
Yeah, it was one of the first 3M digital 32-track recordings.
That's right.
And there was a 24-track analog backup. Didn't Steely Dan buy one of those machines, or did they go straight to the Mitsubishi?
They bought, they bought a 32 and a 4.
Yeah, well, you had to. Yeah, that was...
Nightfly was done on the 3M.
That's a good sounding record. I mean...
Yeah, it's good.
How was your experience working with the Foo Fighters?
Oh, that was unbelievable. I didn't record any of that. Nick
Raskulinecz.
Okay, he produced and recorded that whole record. So there were 2 records. One was all acoustic, one was all electric. And on the acoustic record, he did things like a single track of drums. Just did it.
Wow.
He had plenty of tracks.
Old school.
He wanted a single track of drums. And he wasn't old enough to remember that, but he did it. You know, everything was like pretty mono in terms of how it was split. And he talked Dave into doing the acoustic record in analog and having it mixed in 5.1 in stereo. And they let me do both. Nick was at Dave's studio in the Valley doing the electric stuff that hadn't been finished yet. And I was doing the acoustic stuff at Capitol. And it got to be, you know, when I did all the stereos and sent them over to him, you know, it wasn't a problem, but they didn't want to get in the car while they were recording, drive all the way to Capitol, listen to a mix, and then go back. So I get around to doing the surround on it, and I had just done a deal with Acura and Panasonic to do the 5.1 for Acura. They couldn't listen to surround there. They weren't equipped. They didn't have speakers. They couldn't do it. So I said, well, let me get you something. And I called up Acura and I said to one of the girls there, who's a big Foo Fighters fan, I said, do you suppose you can get a car up to their studio just so they could listen to the surrounds? And that's what she brought the car up there, met the guys, and she drove back down. They listened to all the surround mixes in the Acura, and they approved in the Acura from what they heard.
That's a riot. That's the ultimate car test, the 5.1 car test. That's hysterical.
Yeah.
How was your experience working on, again, one of my favorite records, Beck? It was which Beck record was it? It was
I did two. Guerrero was the second one. The first one
was Sea Change. Is that the name?
Sea Change.
Oh God, I love Sea Change.
That was amazing.
Yeah, it's a great record.
God, it was so much fun to do it. And I called Nigel, who produced the record, and because I'd heard that the stereo mixes, I heard that there were rough mixes at Studio B, where I did Hornsby at Ocean Way, and he said, "Yeah, they were. You get used to writing faders, and you get everything the way you want it, and you just put it up, and it mixes itself."
Yeah.
I had one or two conversations with Beck, and he said, "Well, when you get one done, will you send it over? And so we can hear what it sounds like." So I called MCA and I said, "Where are you guys going to play this? I'm going to send it to you." What was that little tape format?
DA88.
DA88. So I put 6 tracks on that. I recorded, though, to an analog 8-track and then transferred.
Wow.
I send the tape, and they play it for him, and I get a call from Nigel, and he said, "This sounds awful. I don't understand this at all." And I said, "Well, tell me, what are you hearing?" And he said, "Well, why is this vocal coming from the back rear, the right rear?" I said, "Oh, God." I said, "It's clearly marked where each track goes. So whoever had this didn't have it allocated right." And so I spoke to the guy, and I went through where it needs to be. And about half an hour later, I got a call from Nigel. He says, "I'm sorry, just do what you're doing, and it'll be fine."
On 5.1, how do you handle the center channel?
I never put much in the center. I would put a little bit of vocal, but not enough to interfere with left and right. Most of the vocals are coming left and right. I also put the bass drum in the center, along with left and right and rears, but minimal amounts, and the sub. And I put the bass in there as well, and that was pretty much it.
You really made me happy saying that, because on my Billy mixes, I got criticism on the internet for not using the center channel.
And that's the biggest problem with Atmos. The minute you go to center, everything else you've mixed, it changes. The whole thing changes. Like Nico Bolas was the guy who told me about that. He kept saying, every time I went to the center, the whole image changed.
Yeah, and one thing that I sort of found in headphones, and I think it was a little bit more in Apple, it's almost like with their simulation, the center speaker is back a foot. Because what would happen is I'd get the vocal level right where I wanted it, and I'd pan to the center. It's like, no, I don't want him back 6 inches. I want him where he was, But it's just, I'm glad to hear you say that, because throughout the internet, your 5.1 mixes are considered the most brilliant.
No, your mixes sounded great.
Oh, thanks. I'll put that in the video.
Yeah. I heard it. I thought it was great.
Thanks. That means a lot. That means a lot coming from you.
Well, I know the originals.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It had the same impact as the originals.
Yeah, it's funny. I called up like 52nd Street, and I put up the stereo because I get all the stereos from the label to compare it to, and I go, man, this is a real forceful mid-range on this. So I called Ted Jensen, and I go, Ted, is that Phil and Jim, or was that you? And he pulls up the cutting card. He goes, no, I got a couple dB here and there. So I mixed it with that forward mid-range. When you remixed Van Morrison's Moondance in 5.1, any surprises? What did you think when you went back and looked at it?
I was surprised how few tracks there were. Like one cut was 6 tracks with the full band. I'm going, holy shit. Wow. How did this happen?
Well, you had 6 speakers. That must have worked out.
It did, I think on one of the cuts I put the drums in the rear on both speakers, because we did that in R1. And I remember walking in, Van's guitar was weird sounding. I went to either look at the mic or check it or hear his guitar. But I remembered they were playing the song as I walked in there, and how it, when I turned around to face Van, the drums were behind me. And so I went with how it was when I walked in that moment.
I haven't heard the 5.1 of Moondance, but I'll bet it's great, because I think stuff that's very intimate and simple is great for surround, where you can pan the discrete elements out and it still feels sort of unified.
Yeah, I agree. And they did an Atmos version of it a couple of years ago, and actually remixed the stereo as well. And some guy sent me an email, went to the site, and was a comparison of what the original stereo versus the new stereo, and my 5.1 versus Atmos. A lot of people that were voicing their opinion of what the 69 version sounded like. It was classical remix of what instruments sounded like in those days. You know, I mixed that in, do you remember Mix 2?
I remember Mix 1 in A3, but I don't remember Mix 2.
Where was A3?
A3 was the room that John Curcio did all the 3-machine mixing in, which was right next to, it was when you went down the hallway, it was the first door on your right. And
Yep.
it still had, it was probably had the old A1 console because it had a rotary fader tube console in there.
That was Mix 2 when it opened up. I did Moondance in there.
You're kidding.
No, it had the original console from the mix room on the old 112 building where Phil did all those mixes.
But that's a tiny room.
Very tiny.
Yeah, that's amazing. When I was there, it just had a pair of JBL L100s on the wall and it was about 10 feet deep.
When we opened it, it was 604Es.
And there was a tube console in there, which you said was from the original A&R.
Right, the mix room at A&R on the second floor.
Now, do you remember Eddie Kramer blamed the pre-echo vocal bleed on Whole Lotta Love? He mixed it at A&R, and he blamed it on that console for having crosstalk, originally.
He did?
Yeah. It's been debunked since.
Oh, okay.
What they found out was, you remember when a headphone cord used to hang by a guitar pickup? The Q mix would go into the guitar?
Yeah.
And so what they found was it was actually the original live vocal bled into the guitar through the Q mix. So
Okay.
I was just curious if you knew that or
No, not at all.
It's pretty funny though. So many rabbit holes with this stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I think that if somebody wants a great playlist on Spotify or Apple or whatever, they should load up all your 25 Grammy nominations. It's really pretty cool. No, there's some cool stuff in there. You work with Beck, Beyonce. Did you have any contact with Sting or Aerosmith when you were working on those records?
Yeah, with Aerosmith, yeah. Those were some amazing times. I came in, I got the call from management. Kevin Shirley produced the record. He was remixing the album. They wanted me to remix only the singles. We had been working at Studio C at Avatar, but we went to record the strings at Studio A at the Hit Factory, that really big room. Everything's set up. Now, I thought Kevin would want to do this. He said, no, I'm just going to listen. You know, you record everything the way you record it. And I learned how to record really record strings. That was the one thing, I got to be honest here, with Phil, doing strings was weird to me. It was one mic for every two violins.
Two guys, yeah, every two chairs, yeah.
And then, I watched Al record the string section, and it was two mics for the entire string section. Yeah. You go, oh my God. So I set it up like that, and it was a monstrous sound. And Kevin, he's reading the charts. And the first song we did, after we do a take, he gets on talkback and he says, hey, David, I think the second violin should be playing a C, not a C sharp. And I looked over at him going, wow, where did that come from? Mm-hmm. He said, well, I'm a French horn player. I said, oh, my God. I would come at night and mix singles, and they would be working during the day, and mixing the record. And in the lounge at sea, it was outside the room, right near the stairway, there were like 10 cases of 6-ounce Coke bottles. You know, they had to have Cokes. Those
maybe, yeah, maybe it was a substitute for something else.
Maybe, but it was a good thing.
Yeah. I listened to the demo of your Toontrack's drum sample library. And I was hitting play and I'm going, no, I know this sound. This is a sound when you have a bunch of mics open in a room with a drummer. Like, I couldn't wrap my head around, like, I almost don't believe that I was hearing samples because of all the air around everything. It was just like, no, I know this sound. It's when you're getting sounds on drums, you pull up all the mics, and this is what it sounds like. Well, it's amazing.
Have you worked for those guys?
No.
Basically, that's what it was. You know, I mic'd things the way I mic it, and I got the drums up. Their drummer is very good. And, you know, I just got everything up to where I liked it, and they would sample stuff.
They're amazing.
Yeah.
Because they sound very real. For a long time, you know, there was that you would go through samples and it was, you know, it was just like 7 different trash cans. But these drum sounds sound like authentic, like a real human.
Yeah, that's what it is.
And you did them at Clubhouse?
I did them at Clubhouse, and once everything was up, everything stayed open. You're doing the bass drum, all the mics are open now.
Yeah, I think that's what I was hearing. You know, is I was hearing the authentic room.
Yeah,
yeah, and hearing it on every drum is compelling. You know, as opposed to just adding it to something. You know.
Yeah. It was fun to do.
The Madeleine Perot record, again, we talked about that with the bass drum sound. That sounds great.
Did I put too much in?
No. It was just, if it was too much, I would have perceived it that way. It was just like, man, it was the sound. It wasn't the volume. It was just phenomenal. Maybe I'll see if I can find a clean one and sample it.
That's the mic I used.
Oh, so are the drum samples going to be similar? Would you have a similar kick sound to that Madeleine Perot record?
It's the same kick sound.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Thanks again. I've had a fantastic time. And like I say, we're going to start doing this every month.
Me too. I had a really great time doing this with you. It's one of the more legitimate, freeloading interview I've ever done, you know, and it feels good. And I'm happy you asked me to do this.
Thanks, man.